It's Katie Crysdale here from Lakeview Aquatic Consultants. Welcome back, or welcome if you are new here. I'm thrilled to be joined by Kate Connell. So, welcome back, Kate.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Kate is everything equitable aquatics. I wanted to catch up with her about her latest article on the AOAP website about how we can make first aid more inclusive. Can you talk us through this article and what inspired you to write it?
Originally, the article came from an education session created that helped us in the field think more holistically about people's differences and how their personal identities come into play in emergency situations, but particularly when we're interacting with them around first aid and life saving type situations. And we might feel we need to handle the emergency separately, but when we really look at it, we want to make sure that we're taking into account those differences because they can help someone feel more safe or understood. There's just some basic ways we can be thinking about what inclusion in first aid looks like. I have found this is sometimes advanced for people because we feel like we're already behind the eight ball with training, and it feels like one more thing to teach them to be sensitive to or mindful of can be a really tall order. In other ways, I feel like we're already mindful of these things. Some people are already taking these situations or scenarios and using them to role play. Are already having staff conversations and practice that are mindful of these identity differences and things that might be related to someone's gender or ability or past trauma, the cultural background, and they're already factoring those things in. Article is intended to be a little bit of an introduction if you haven't thought about how to work with your staff on making sure they're mindful of the ways we can be more inclusive around first aid, but then also hopefully a few extra ideas for anybody who has already had this thought, but maybe hasn't figured out how to combine the two together.
It's also important to think of we don't have to adopt every principle for every class. Maybe we can start small. For me, skin color has been an easy one in first aid programming to have a conversation in the group. How might that change our ability to detect burns or flushed skin? That's an easy one for people to think about if they're not comfortable approaching more complex topics.
One of the things I didn't get into in this article is the medical industry has been historically slow to be mindful of these differences, but there has been a lot of movement in research and even influencers in the medical field as students or as professionals having conversations around what different types of disorders, injuries, and disease can look like on different skin. So we have some real good resources we visually can work into without moving too far from our curriculum. Obviously, we don't want to add in things outside of our scope, but there are ways we can be using resources that are established. And a lot of times, some of the cultural differences we talk through take quite a bit of critical thinking and needing to be culturally sensitive. But something like skin color is streamlined, where it's a fact that injuries can look different on different skin. And how do we have conversations when we're looking at it in an initial assessment? It's also something that really can't be refuted. There are some things we talk through that might feel charged. Like if we're talking about someone's gender identity, we might have someone that has personal feelings as a responder, where skin color and noting differences, we can't argue about that necessarily. It's just a factual thing.
I love what you suggest in the article that tools like visual aids can be very helpful. Speaking for myself, where I'm based in Alberta, it is not as common to have many people of color in my classes. So I am using a lot of printed photos to actually provide examples for discussion. For people who might be overwhelmed or sensitive to, am I going to say the wrong thing? Starting with pictures and just having a conversation informally and not teaching, but facilitating a discussion might be a safer way to start.
With the idea of having different resources, I also think when we have something physical, it can also provide direction for those folks leading trainings. One of the things we've talked about before is sometimes people don't feel like they're in authority on talking about these things. So they can agree that we want to be mindful in first aid situations to make sure that inclusive first aid is a reflection of our ability and our willingness to help everybody. But how do we actually teach this though? Having actual physical photos or translation flashcards where you don't necessarily need to know Spanish or French or other languages that would be really common in your area of service, but you certainly could have literal things that you pull out of a toolbox that can help you try to facilitate conversation, additional understanding. That might look like different pictures that help someone be able to communicate about what they're experiencing, can open up conversations that might be really hard to have otherwise if someone is non-speaking. I think that's really helpful too, because it also requires staff to honestly do less. It's not that we have staff that aren't willing to do these things. It's just that we have a lot of stuff that's begging for their attention. First aid is certainly life or death, but making people feel comfortable in the process might not be. It might be one of those things that feels like an add-on. Being able to have some of these things, make sure you can move through the process, it doesn't become an afterthought, it becomes something that can really truly include in the process and in the training as well.
It's really, really important to highlight just starting somewhere because I get very easily overwhelmed when there's 7 or 8 changes I want to implement. And we need to start small and just pick one. Maybe for this first aid class, it's skin color. For the next first aid class, it's more visual tools.
Another easier, more accessible place to start too is talking about disability, because we already have some conversations around that, especially as we're doing our actual first aid training in regards to things like compressions and limb difference and how we would adjust or modify if someone's suspected to be pregnant. Like, as we talk about differing bodies, that does open a door for us to talk about how we would approach giving equitable care where the goal is still to give first aid care. This obviously also opens up a conversation around giving compressions to someone who has breast tissue and how we make sure these things are also not the first time they've thought about it or been exposed to it when it's such a high stress real situation. How do we try to simulate some of these things so we take out the, I call them awe moments, the awkward, weird, and ew. Not that all of these things fall into those categories, but some of these things do feel awkward for a young adult. There might be some factors that feel different, and we might not have some of the cultural competency to deal with those things in a non accelerated instance. How do we have some of those conversations so that people just aren't surprised by the realities of these situations? And when someone that's receiving care or needs care isn't necessarily behaving in a way we've seen on a video or in a way we've maybe imagined in our brain or how we role play with our team members.
You're absolutely right. I mean, sticks have shown women are less likely to receive CPR treatment by bystanders who are not comfortable with undressing the upper body, exposing the breasts, maybe are concerned about any type of accusation that might occur. And that's something that we do need to prepare our candidates for. Realistically, can't perform well, excuse me, I should say you can perform CPR through clothing, but you can't apply an AED. The pads require direct flesh contact, which is on the chest, which is going to require exposing the breasts or removing a bra. That's a very real barrier.
I think the reality too is we want to train the team to have the culture of being inclusive, but sometimes it's balance between actual practice that feels applicable with also having conversations. There is benefit to having conversations about these things, but it can be difficult to pull conversations back in, especially when we're in a time period right now where there's been some reward to being more outspoken about being in disagreement with some of these ideas. It's really that balance of making it obvious that there are different skills, different scenarios that are being practiced, and use of equipment. So it doesn't feel like it's a standalone thing, but it feels like an inclusive part of the training culture and making sure that you're not making assumptions around the care and how you're teaching that level of care as well.
If you can get some resources to dedicate to this, it's helpful. But obviously, in the current economic climate, not everybody has money to spare. They don't necessarily have grant opportunities or funding. We've both spoken about the Prestan first aid mannequins come in a variety of different flesh tones now, and they also do come with breasts, which is pretty unique on the market in terms of creating a environment for people who would be comfortable to explore CPR and AED pad placement on that equipment. Not everybody has that budget because those mannequins are very high quality and have related costs based on the sensors and systems to monitor compression rate, rhythm, and depth. If you can't do that, Aquatics Vibe, which is a resource lots of you follow on social, they have excellent resource where you can DIY your own bra on a mannequin that can simulate a chest for your first aid lifeguard candidates. That's a really inexpensive way to go to Walmart or your local general retailer to set that up for your next in-service. And it doesn't have to be every mannequin or every station in a course. It could just be starting out with one or two and then going from there based on feedback and budget considerations.
Another one to think about how we can DIY mannequins that are of larger size. So mannequins tend to be one size. Men's are all different sizes. There's also data around people that living in bigger bodies, having less access or more barriers to appropriate care. Maybe even I know that we talked about budget constraints, but as you're aging out of old mannequins, finding some ways to adjust those and DIY that a little bit to give your team some diversity of mannequins would be really a helpful tool.
One of the things I learned from a committee I was on related to drowning technology, we were looking for something that would allow us to create a mannequin of our own for testing. The morph suits some people wear at Halloween or a spandex full body suit that can work really well to compress if you're bundling clothing and life jackets, but then you need to strap it down in a way that won't fall apart. The morph suit does take away the human aspect of the mannequin, but it can allow you to have a bigger, bulkier mannequin, both in the pool and to drag around the pool deck.
There is a market, there is a product that is a larger person. The big thing is figuring out that balance between DIY, but then also potentially budgeting further out. Maybe you're able to add in one mannequin to your rotation when you're buying them every few years in your cycle. The other thing when I was an operator is I would work with my team to ask them how they thought we could DIY some of this stuff. And some of them that's definitely in their zone of genius. That's all that it takes. Here's what we're trying to do. What ideas do you have? And go from there. I think we don't collectively do a good enough job at seeing like what other adjacent industries are doing and then trying to figure out how do we translate that to aquatics. So one of the areas in this line of thinking is the medical industry, the first responder space, and looking at what are they doing? What is coming out for information? There's influencers now in that space talking about these different things. That can be a really good thing for a professional aquatics person to be tapped into so they can be thinking critically, how do I translate this to my frontline staff?
Going back to your staff, that they are a resource as well. So I know when I moved to a rural community in northern Alberta, I was certainly the outsider. Although I had experience managing an aquatic facility, I didn't have the lived experience of growing up in that community. We had a very distinct Lebanese community, very distinct white Russian community. So going to some of my team members and saying, can you explain to me a little bit your lived experience, cultural practices, community experiences living in this place? Because even coming from a big city like Toronto, where I've seen many different types of cultural expression, it's very unique and grounded in the communities where we live.
Absolutely.
One other point I wanted to make is what I've been hearing Kate say a lot too is that we get concerned about making waves at work or the legalese or the requirements to do something or make a change. But I think sometimes even just approaching the situation, your next training, educating yourself, networking from a place of empathy and wanting to learn, very honestly, is also a good starting point that you're setting the intention. I know I could do better in this area and not overly harsh on yourself if you can't make that many changes right away.
The empathy, the curiosity, creative thinking, the ability to just question what has been done is really the precursor to any work as it's related to equity. We think of them as more soft skills, but all of that stuff is going to benefit everything from customer service to the experience that people have. So if we're approaching first aid with curiosity and empathy, we're using communication and really trying our best to make sure everyone feels safe, respected, and seen in our settings. That can only more positively inform the experience people have, which hopefully the majority of the time is a non-emergency based experience and it's a positive one.
There's a lot for us to think about. So I want to redirect everyone back to Kate Connell's article, which you can find on the AOAP website, which I will link to in the description box below. It's entitled Make First Aid Care and Training More Inclusive. It's a great jumping off point to figure out next steps in terms of implementing this at your aquatic facility, recreation facility, volunteer spheres, or any other areas of work or life. There's value in considering other perspectives from what we've been doing so far. Thanks so much for being here, and we'll catch up with Kate again soon.